distinguished officials of the dais and friends. I'm extremely grateful to the Department of Personnel and the initiative that they have taken for introducing and improving upon citizen-centric governance, for having invited me to associate with this workshop today. From the reports which were just given and the address of the Honorable Minister, it appears that we are concentrating on simplifying processes. That, of course, is a laudable effort. But one important point which the Secretary in DIPP made was India needs a huge sea change in terms of a mindset, how the state deals with its citizens. And this mindset impacts not merely on processes, it also impacts through formulation of policy. I've always wondered if we didn't have a government, what would happen? It'll always remain a vexed question whether we'll become anarchic or utopian. Because governments are necessary to enforce the rule of law, to make orderly conduct of life in a country. So that the country doesn't turn anarchic. But at times, too much governance can also add misery to life. And therefore, governments, while formulating policy and deciding their overall approach, will always have to decide where a balance lies. I firmly hold a view that when in power, there is always a desire to regulate. India has changed, and I must say, in all fairness, even civil service is changing. Governments are also changing. But policy makers in India, and I'm here referring to the political policy makers, the mindset is still regulatory. So if you actually see the debates in Parliament, the ministers may, as a part of a general reform process, try and ease in systems in terms of policy and processes. But 9 out of 10 speeches always advocate greater regulatory measures. So the control temperament or the control freak temperament of the political system has still not been fully done away with. And there is a legacy. I remember, of course, the resources were also inadequate at that time. So you can't only blame the governments, but you certainly have to blame them because they pursued a policy to make resources inadequate. If I look back and on 2 yardsticks, when I said the basic question is whether without governments we'll be anarchic or we'll be utopian, the principal purpose of a government and policy is merely to improve the quality of life of people and provide them an ease of life. You can't have a population living in stress and distress. You can't have an over-regulated society. You can't have a government which many people relish, which is the original form of what is the My Baap government. So you look at the state for every benefit. Both the economic and the political model that the Marxists had advocated globally over the last 3 decades has been smashed. And therefore you have different models which have taken over world over. I recollect as a child when I was growing up, and I remember India in the decades of the 60s, a little before or after that, what was the kind of life that we were providing to our citizens? And this is giving a reasonable rebate for the fact that the national resources were inadequate. We were all training our society and our people to live in an economy of shortages. So the number of houses was short. And if the number of houses was short, you had to have rent control. And if you had to have rent control, why should I build houses when I can get a cheaper place on rent and I can never be ejected? So the whole housing and real estate and hence quality of life suffered. We thought it was evil to allow private institutions to open colleges. So state with its inadequate resources would open schools and colleges. Some other missionaries or other caste or religious groups, the DAV and others would, Khalsa institutions would open colleges or schools. So keep inadequate number of institutions. I remember when I first became an MP, the first very day when our identity card used to be given to us, and that was not decades ago, it was about 16 years ago, the first thing which was handed over to us was, along with our identity cards, a large bunch of booklets by which we had a discretion to give gas connections to people. Then we were also given a record that out-of-turn telephone connections could be given by us. The only facility which now remains is that we are allowed some out-of-turn Kendriya Vidyalaya admissions. And suddenly when the system was changing, the then Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, with his sense of humor, he said when he became a Prime Minister member, and he said this continued till the 70s, I was not aware of it, each member of parliament also had an authority to sanction out-of-turn scooters and 2 HMT watches every year. So the so-called policies of the 50s which we hail was attuned to get people to adjust to shortages. So the amount of sugar you consume had to be regulated, the amount of wheat everybody got had to be regulated, the amount of kerosene people got had to be regulated, school fees had to be regulated. And we lived by regulation, and therefore with over-regulation there was no initiative for any form of growth. And I think these forms that you are talking about were a necessary byproduct of that process. Many countries in the world slowly started changing. I am one of those who believe that what started in 1991 should have actually started in 1971. And that is why probably the 70s and 80s would always go down as the wasted decades of Indian growth stories. And what did some of those regulations achieve? There's a current member in the Niti Aayog, Vivek Debroy, who wrote a very nice book on obsolete laws. And if you read some of those chapters of the book, till about 15 years ago, we had laws continuing. One of the laws is called the Sarai Act. So the Sarai Act related to a period where there was no transport system and people travelled on horses and camels. And if they had to come from, let us say, Peshawar and go to Bombay, then they'll spend months doing it. So they travel during the day and sleep somewhere at night in a sarai. So it was mandatory for every sarai to offer them a right to drink water and offer them a toilet. So we said all hotels in India will require a registration under the Sarais Act. So till the 90s, every hotel in India had the same obligation continuing. And the hotel which was most visited, because people used to go and see the gateway of India at Mumbai, so they would then determine that they had a right to enter the Taj Mahal hotel and enforce their rights under the Sarai Act, till the hotel became unworkable. So the Taj Mahal hotel management decided to create a toilet block next to the sea. There is still one. And then the other department of the government said, no, you can't do it because it violates the CRZ zone. So this is how we regulated the whole system. And I think a lot of changes started, particularly in the last 24, 25 years. And we must remember, as particularly those of you who are entering the service now, that reforms is a process or a system where there is no finishing line. It's a race which is never going to end. The needs of the system and society are going to discover something which has to change almost by the day. So what did the government in 91 do? The first thing they did was to dismantle the licensing requirements of law. Now, the licensing requirements of law came from the fact that even though industries is a state subject, there is a category of industries which used to be covered under the IDRA Act, which was so declared, where you required a central permission. So Amitabh's department was the most powerful department in the country till 1991, where people had to line up either to ask for a license to do business in India, or line up to make sure that the competitor doesn't get it. You know what was the result of this? The kind of suffering that act and this department had caused. You had a choice of 2 or 3 cars with obsolete technology and a 10-year waiting list. You had a choice of 2 two-wheeler scooters with a 20-year waiting list. Your telecommunications, if you applied for a phone, there used to be a list. Until the 1990s, the list used to be, we have cleared the waiting list as till 1962. So 20 years, 30 years to get a telephone. And I think dismantling the role of the state made us better off. It gave plurality of choice. It encouraged competition. It encouraged quality. It encouraged people to invest. And when the telecom services were opened up in 94, 95, the regulatory mindset, if you read the parliament debates of that time, China will listen to our conversations. So these were the kind of arguments which were used. And the best, easiest way to stop a reform is to say, well, national security doesn't permit it. But the result of the whole process was that post-91 India has gradually transformed from shortages to surpluses. Today we have an entirely different problem. So in terms of many commodities, the nature of our problems and challenges have changed. So we have surplus sugar, we have surplus wheat, we have surplus rice, we have surplus cotton, we have surplus in steel. So we have even surplus in power now. And we are still struggling because our secretaries here as deputy secretaries were trained how to manage shortages, and now as secretaries they have to be trained how to manage surpluses. And therefore prices of commodities are collapsing. And an alternative model will have to be found out. I think therefore when you speak in terms of citizen-centric governance, the first underlying rule is that every action must be aimed in providing a better quality of life and ease to the citizen. Wherever possible, the role of state should be minimized. And therefore, unless we are able to generate a whole system where from services to products, it must be intended to generate a surplus in the society. You have surplus in engineering seats, but you have inadequacy of medical seats. And therefore, if you are able to generate a surplus, your entire problems of high fees, high capitation fees, no rural doctors available in the rural areas, bulk of your problems automatically resolve themselves. So whether it is the social infrastructure or it's the physical infrastructure, the policy will have to be always so designed. Governmental monopolies must end. Now wherever we vended them, we are better off. We vended them in the airline sector, we haven't ended them in the railway sector. And the result is very clear. The size of our railways, because the British didn't build highways, they built the railways. So we've added about 10 to 15% in the last 68 years. But in sectors which we had to start and where we brought in other segments of society, we brought in a lot of people and we brought in a lot of investment. There are many ways of doing this. Now, as far as your processes are concerned, you'll have to, for every department, they'll have to undertake a simplification exercise. And particularly those departments which have the interface of the public with them. And who has the interface of public? From the local municipalities and panchayats to the taxation authorities, to educational departments. Dr. Jitendra Singh was speaking in terms of transfers. I can tell you, I have a large number of elected representatives who visit me every day. And I anxiously await them to come and tell me about policy changes required in the governance. But all I get every day is dozens of applications for transfers of bank officials or tax inspectors, as though the job of the North Block is only confined to that. Now, I think this whole mindset in terms of elected governance, and when we go around the country and visit, it's only these kind of applications that you will receive. And therefore, this really will have to change. Now, I'll give you some specific illustrations. You have millions of people across the country getting state support subsidies. One of our former prime ministers, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, had said only 15% subsidy reaches the poor. Now, this entire system of what we have started referring to as the jam trinity, the Janadhan, the mobile and the Aadhaar platform, the impact of this can be a person gets a scholarship from the center and the state. He is entitled to only one. Individual have multiple LPG gas connections in their name, and each one is subsidized. Tomorrow it may be food. Day after it could be some other segment. Now, putting LPG on jam itself has almost saved 30% subsidy. It's eliminated multiple connections. Now we've decided all the Manrega payments, the center pays the state sends it to the districts give it to the panchayats, and maybe a minuscule fraction reaches the beneficiary. Now the bank accounts of all the Manrega workers will directly get money from the center. So it has to be an automatic transfer. He doesn't have to go anywhere, he doesn't have to fill a form, he doesn't have to go to the panchayat head, he doesn't have to go to the collectorate. Whether it's the old age pensions or the widow pensions, the state governments give it. Scholarship to children and minority children, there are huge programs of the government. Lakhs of children get it every year. Now you have the technology in place, you have the systems in place. And therefore this whole idea of simplifying form has now to be thought one step ahead, that forms must go. Because technology itself is going to make these forms redundant. I'll give you a simpler example. A department which has a very bad reputation, conventionally, and maybe for good reason, has been the income tax department. Now there are systems which have started on the strength of technology. People are being persuaded, file your returns only in the electronic mode. So returns are being filed. So you don't have to go anywhere, you just file it sitting at home. What are the changes required in the system? First, you file your returns in the electronic mode. The assessments are made, and for the current year, the returns have been filed. The date was extended from 31st August to 7th September. And while I speak to you on 12th September, 5 days thereafter, the CBDT has informed me that it's so easy that in about 26,000 odd cases, the exact number I'm missing out on, the tax refunds have already been dispatched. Last year, out of the 3.5 crore odd returns filed, 1 crore 35 lakh odd people got refunds. So now you don't need people to go to your houses and give you refunds and ask for a kickback. So smaller amounts were transferred directly to the bank accounts. The bigger amounts, you were electronically informed, and within 24 hours, the speed post goes with a check. So 1 crore 35 lakh people received their refunds, a system which has been reasonably notorious in the past. But then it will take time for both the public servants and elected representatives to adjust. This year on the 28th of February, when I was reading the budget, only once during the entire reading was I heckled. And that is where the entire regulatory mindset comes in. When you speak in terms of ease of doing business, you have to provide to your investor a regime which is better than the regime that your neighbor has. Otherwise, he says, well, such and such country gives me these facilities. How do I come to you when I get a better tax rate? You charge me 15% more tax than another country does, so I'd rather invest there. So you have to make your taxes and your systems globally compatible. Our rate of corporate tax is 30%. We charge surcharges, it comes to about 34% plus. But then we as governments have retained the power of discretion. And that discretion is, to some segments I will start giving exemptions. So it's a great pleasure when people come to you with a begging bowl and ask for exemptions. There may be exemptions for individuals, societies. I'm not talking of the exemptions which are incentives for savings, which an individual assessee gets. So as a result of all the corporate exemptions, and I'm only referring to corporate, the actual realization with the government is 22%. So we have a bad image of a 34% plus tax charging country, but our receipt is 24%, 22%. There is, because of these exemptions, bulk of the tax litigation is around these exemptions. So I took a decision that I would bring down the corporate tax down over the next 4 years to 25%, and I will phase out all the exemptions, or most of them. So in the end, I would probably end up getting a higher amount of tax, but then a corporate taxation return also would be minimal because there are no exemptions to be claimed. This is my income, this is the tax paid, that's the end of the matter. And optically the taxation would be globally compatible because 22-25% is a globally compatible rate. This was the only question on which I had to pause for a little while till the house became peaceful. But then this is the kind of reform we'll require. Nobody had the courage to say, every man possessing some property in India or some jewelry beyond a certain limit had to file a wealth tax return. So we run a huge department. The highest tax we have got is about 900 crores in the whole year from the whole country. And it generated a huge amount of corruption. So last year I said wealth tax is abolished, the super rich will have to pay some 2% surcharge extra. So millions of returns have disappeared with effect from this year. Now this is a kind of a processes that we require. And why can't we not carry them on to other areas? Now whole den of corruption is municipalities. And municipalities is the face of government. It's impossible in a usual manner to get a permission, in a simplified manner to construct a house or a building. So from sanctioning of your plans, you go thereafter to the completion certificates, occupancy certificates. Engineers and inspectors come every day. The world is now moving to a situation where the qualified architects know what the municipal laws are. So an architect would certify your plan as being within the rules and you can start your construction. And when you finally have built the building, You go back and say, well, I have constructed it, this is as per rules, they come and check it and give you a certificate. Just now, in the Brics Bank, it was India's term to nominate the president, so we nominated Mr. Kamath. So after being nominated within a fortnight, he went to Beijing to take an idea of what the office was. So one official of the ministry accompanied him. So the Chinese who were insisting that the headquarters be in China received him and said, we'd like to take you to your office. So when he arrived there, there was an office, a very large office which was ready for the Brics Bank to start functioning. So he entered and occupied his chair in his office, and then the whole office was functioning. So amongst the visits he told me, they said, this is your temporary office. And then they again took him along and showed him a piece of land and said, this is yours. This is the allocation letter to the Brics Bank. Your regular permanent headquarters of the banks will start coming up here. Now, what would we have done in India today if we had to give a headquarter to the Brics Bank and we needed the land? And I'm using this opportunity to explain to you whether the industry that the Department of DIPP wants, which will give poor people jobs, or for rural roads, or for any other purpose, under the 2013 law, we'll first notify the land. Then we'll have to go and get a consent from 80% of the landowners. Then you'll have a 52-month schedule for a social impact assessment. And then the other procedures will follow. The Brics would have said, well, we'd like to shift our headquarters to another country. And your investors would have said, I think Malaysia or Indonesia is a better option. The whole concept of ease of doing business is that between a decision to invest and the actual launch of the project, the time must be minimal. We in India have started using phrases that we lay down red carpets. But that red carpets are laid when we try and persuade people to invest. After we invest them, we did do what the government at that particular time, let us say, did to a project like POSCO. You frustrate them to an extent that they say, well, I think my options are better elsewhere. And therefore, in the ease of businesses which was referred to, unless you are able to provide the infrastructure, the land, the facilities required, an adequate taxation regime, it's never going to be so easy. At the end of the day, between 6 to 8% growth and 8 to 10% growth, what is the difference? One difference is, of course, in a globally adverse circumstances, it becomes difficult. But that's an external factor. The external instability is a factor. But dehors that if we make some discounts for that and factor that in, domestically, quicker permissions. In trade decisions, it is expected and anticipated, and that's the global calculation, that 14% addition to costs can take place because of trade facilitation. So between an exporter in another country and an exporter in India, from manufacturing till it departs from the seaport, the entire process of infrastructure and facilitation can add to costs by 14%. And if your product is going to be 14% costlier than the other man's product, then the hard reality is that consumers like buying cheaper products. They don't consciously buy costlier products. You're going to miss the bus. And therefore, in every process, whether it's economic or even if it is a process which is, as I said, relevant to local livings. I gave the example of municipalities or taxation. Let's take the example of courts. Courts in India have a broad approach where they would like to stricture governments for not complying with taking decisions expeditiously. But then wherever time limits are set for courts to take a decision, every judgment has said this is directory and not mandatory. So when I was the law minister, I amended the Civil Procedure Code and said this must be done in 60 days, this must be done in 30 days. So the whole parliamentary verdict was frustrated by a Supreme Court judgment which said, well, these dates that the parliament has told us to do it in are all directory and not mandatory. For good reasons, we can violate this time schedule. And that's why the result of this is that every international investment in India, it's written loud and clear, no jurisdiction of Indian courts. It will be an arbitration in some foreign soil under a substantive law and a procedural law which belongs to some other country. So international investors start with a statement of no confidence because of the pace of Indian courts. So the courts will also have to realize this. Now, I can't understand. We've now sanctioned a lot of money for making courts technology compliant, and therefore, slowly but surely, most of the pleadings, etc., all those procedural dates have to get on to be eliminated, and this can only be done on the net itself. I think there are many other areas, and I'd refer to 2-3 of them. One is a very powerful interface of government, which is the police. And I think it is here that the largest reform is required in India. If there's a single largest reform required, it's in a police-citizen relationship. And no amount of discussion on citizen-centric reforms would be complete till that becomes a civilized relationship. There are many countries in the world, it's become a very civilized relationship. You can't have a society where people are scared and reluctant to deal with the police. They are reluctant to file a complaint. They are reluctant to seek assistance from a police. Ladies would be advised not to visit the police station. You can't have a system in which, and therefore the police training, their attitude towards the citizen. The bobby in England is always considered a friend. If you lose your way and you were to ask him, he's your best friend who will tell you where to go and where not to go. Elsewhere, the systems of dealing with the public are so civilized. I remember several years ago, more than 1.5 decades or maybe more than that, with my family, I entered Switzerland through air. And at the airport, I decided to take, they have lovely trains, to buy ticket to go to the destination we were staying. So the lady at the counter asked me, "Are you here for a vacation?" I said, "Yes." "How many are you?" I said, "We are 4 of us." "How many children?" 2. "How long are you here?" I said, "For a week." And are you going to go around the state, the country? I said, yes. She says, this ticket will cost you so much to this destination. But if you took a 1 week family pass from me, by just paying a little 20-30% more, you can have travel throughout the state. So every tourist was this was my first interface with the system there. And immediately this is the comfort that you provide to your tourist. I think police, tourism, these are all areas, banking, where this kind of a facilitation has to increase. Distribution of government largesse. I recollect an incident in 1977 when the government at first changed and the state governments also changed. One of the most powerful departments in the state governments used to be the Department of Civil Supplies. And in Delhi, we had a very powerful politician belonging to my party. He was looking after civil supplies. So I once went in the morning to meet him, and I saw about 500 people standing outside his house. And one by one, each one would come with a piece of paper and he would write something on it and put a circle. Now we were in an era of cement shortage. So you had to go to the minister for cement shortage. So I want to repair my house, I want to build my house, so I need 25 bags. He would say, all right, take 5. He would put a 5 and put a circle around it. So I said, why do you do this yourself? He said, can you see how many people I am obliging every day? That's the regime. Now, according to me, one of the most disastrous programs in India, which was at that time hailed as almost the 19th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, was that infamous 20-point program of the emergency. One of the laws we brought was the Urban Land Ceiling Act. Urban Land Ceiling Act was that nobody should own urban land more than 500 meters in a big town and a little more in other towns. So what happened was that people who had generated a lot of urban land, so that you could start real estate constructions, you could have multi-story buildings coming up in India, people from villages, suburban centers coming up, as is happening now. So the moment you had that land would be confiscated. So it became the biggest instrument of corruption all over the country. Then we put a provision in that act, it used to be called Section 20, that the minister in charge will have the power to give exemptions. So we concentrated power, we stopped construction all over the country, we concentrated the land, the government hardly got any land under that act, but India's real estate industry went back by 20 years. So what started in the 90s, this creation of suburban townships and urban townships coming up, should have actually started at that time. And everybody who came within the scope of that act, you had, I think you people must have just joined service around that time. So the ministers used to grant the Section 20 exemptions under that act. So nothing was done except putting India's urbanization back by 2 decades. That act only achieved one purpose. So finally, in the year about 2000, when Mr. Vajpayee became the Prime Minister, we decided to repeal it. But because it was a state act, there is a provision in the Constitution that on a state subject, the centre can legislate with the authority of 2 of the states, and then the other states can adopt it. So I am told some of the states till last year had still not fully withdrawn it. So each state had to pass a resolution withdrawing it. Fortunately, now I think most of the states have withdrawn that act. Now, these are areas where we have to make sure that both in policy and in practice, governance is not used for the purposes of being so intrusive, being so regulatory, making life so complicated that people keep running around the government. So that whole balancing act between how much should state regulate, how much does the state want to know, I think is a great balancing act. There is a process of withdrawal of the state from a large number of these areas which is on, and therefore that is the whole concept of minimizing the interference of the state and allowing the citizenry to continue. Land records, I am not going to all those examples because you must have gone through them, is yet another example of this. But I am quite certain that if the Department of Personnel can initiate a changed ethos in India, we'll become a much happier place to live in for our citizens. Thank you.